lecture series. My name is Ismail Akbulut, and I will be presenting this evening. I hope you can hear me well. Okay. So this evening's topic is non-Muslim relations in Islamic history, or in other words, we will look at the dynamics when Muslims were in the majority or when they ruled a country, how they ruled non-Muslims. And of course, we are talking here about a long history. I will not be able to go into details and talk about all examples on how Muslims treated non-Muslims. However, I will pick some examples and I will show you actually positive examples and negative examples on how Muslims treated non-Muslims throughout the history of Islam. And sometimes if you look at when Muslim speakers present this issue, usually there is either a very idyllic or a romantic view on the relationship, so that Muslims sometimes say that everything was perfect. Of course, it wasn't perfect. On the other hand, people who are critical of Islam sometimes portray the history of Muslims as if everything was bad. So I would like to show you good and bad examples in this presentation. And by the way, the month of Ramadan has started, the holy month of Muslims. During this month, Muslims fast from dawn to sundown. So I'm fasting this evening, and we will break fast at about 7:50 p.m. So if I'm a bit slow, please bear with me, be patient. I will do my best to entertain you with this presentation. And by the way, I muted everyone. At the end of this presentation, I will accept questions. Please type your questions in the chat so that I can see them and I can answer them. Okay, now I will share my presentation with you, and I hope you will be able to see the presentation. Okay, I guess you can see my presentation now. Okay. Can somebody write in the chat if you can see my presentation or confirm that? Okay. We will actually talk about this topic, and before we go into the examples on how Muslims treated non-Muslims throughout the history, I will actually talk first about the theology, the interpretation about non-Muslims in Islam, how the religion of Islam views non-Muslims. Because this is important, because from the perspective of Muslims, we have to understand, we have to look at how Muslims view people who are actually non-Muslims. Then we will look at the Ottoman constitution, some positive examples and then negative examples, and we'll come hopefully to a conclusion. Okay. So here I would like to show you some pictures of throughout history on how Muslims, how the media portrayed actually what happened recently in countries where Muslims lived in majority. These pictures are from Syria, Iraq, and from Turkey, recent history of Turkey. So you can see that here are a few ISIS flags, that ISIS took over churches and destroyed the crosses of churches. Further on the bottom of my presentation, you see a picture of cars and then destroyed buildings. This was a pogrom that took place in the 1950s in Istanbul, where Greek Christians were persecuted with this pogrom by mainly Muslim Turks. So this is the reality on what we are seeing in the media. But the question is this Islam? Does Islam ask or command Muslims to do something like that? Now, this picture. In this picture, you see how Muslim leaders, how they engage and interact with non-Muslim leaders. You see the Mufti of Egypt with the Pope. You see a Muslim leader by the name of Fethullah Gulen meeting with John Paul II. You see a church, a synagogue, and a mosque side by side in peaceful coexistence. So the question again is this what Islam commands Muslims to do, or is it what we saw before? In order to understand that, we will look into the Islamic theology, into the main sources, what the religion actually asks Muslims to do. So how are non-Muslims viewed in Islam? So before we go to that, in Islam, Islamic understanding, God is perfect. So there is only one person who is perfect, and that is God. All the creation of God, including followers of religions, are imperfect. And they can make mistakes, including prophets. So prophets such as Muhammad or Jesus or Abraham, Moses, Adam, those are all prophets in the religion of Islam, are all prophets chosen by God, but they can make mistakes. They are not people who are perfect, basically. Now, when we look at the primary sources of Islam, so when Muslims want to deduct laws, basically Sharia is the Islamic law. When Muslim scholars want to deduct laws from the main sources of Islam, what would they do? In what would they look at? What would they look at? They first would look at the Quran. So the Quran is the primary source for Muslims. In Islam, the Quran is God's word. And it is the holy book of Muslims. In Christianity, as far as I know, Jesus is the word of God. In Islam, Muhammad or Jesus are both not the word of God. The Quran is the literal word of God. And Muslims understand the Quran in a literal and symbolical and metaphorical way. And there's many, many different interpretations of that. But this is the first primary source. The second primary source is the Sunnah of the Prophet, basically the tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So how did he live? What did he say? How did he treat people? This is being compiled in books that is then later being called the Sunnah of the Prophet. Then the secondary sources are the consensus of scholars, which is called ijma. So scholars would get together, they would discuss certain issues, they would look at the Quran and the Sunnah. If they cannot find any answer, scholars can come up with ijma, consensus on certain issues. And the fourth one is analogy, qiyas. So scholars would do that as well. They would look at primary sources, secondary sources, consensus of scholars, and if they cannot find any answer, they would make an analogy based on those deductions. This is basically what I'm presenting to you here, the classical understanding of the Sunni world on how to deduct laws. In the Shia world, it is very similar. There's again Quran and Sunnah, and then there is first analogy and then the consensus of scholars. So they switched qiyas and ijma in the Shia. Today in the Muslim world, most schools of jurisprudence still follow this classical concept. There is a few new modern ways to deduct laws, which I haven't captured here. They would rather look into the verses, the history of Muslims, and they would just adapt or make interpretations for today's world. They would pull out the meaning of the verses, and then they would just put that into today's world. So basically, this is the classical way how Muslims deduct laws in Islam. Okay, so what is the goal of Islam? And basically, if you look at the Quran and the Sunnah, the Hadith of the Prophet, we see many references to establishing peace. And it says in those references, Muslims have to establish peace with God, inner peace as a result of that relationship with God, peace with humans, humanity, peace with the animal world, peace with vegetation, and peace with ecological order. This is all captured in primary and secondary sources of Islam. And so one of the main goals of Islam is captured here, which is establishing peace. Now, if we look at God now, how does God look at Muslims and non-Muslims in the religion of Islam? Muslims believe that God, or Allah, is one, and he is impartial towards his creation. What that means is, regardless of whether or not you believe or disbelieve in him, if you sin or you do not sin, God gives you and provides you all his bounties, such as food, such as work, and so on. He does not punish you in this world because you believe or you do not believe in him. So Muslims understand it this way. So he provides for all, regardless of belief, including those who reject faith, or even those who defy him. And he cares for the well-being of all. This is a main stream understanding of Muslims. So this belief implies that all humans are equal before the eyes of God, and in terms of their humanity, irrespective of their particular beliefs. And only God is the ultimate judge of any person's theological correctness. What that means is Muslims are not allowed to punish others or judge others because of belief or disbelief, or believing in a different way. This is not allowed in the theology of Islam. Do Muslims do that? Yes, of course. Muslims are human beings and they do that. But based on the theology of Islam, Muslims must not judge or punish people because of a different understanding of Islam. And no human should be oppressed or mistreated by other fellow humans because of perceived theological incorrectness. Again, for instance, today is Ramadan. I had the free will and the choice not to fast. A Muslim cannot come to me, must not, should not come to me and oppress me and persecute me because I'm not fasting, if I wasn't fasting. Or if I didn't pray, nobody should come and oppress me and persecute me because I'm not fasting or praying. Okay, rejecting of belief in God will have consequences in the afterlife, but not in this life. So if we punish people and persecute people because of disbelief or theological incorrectness, we would actually take on the job of God. We would do whatever God will do in the hereafter, and this is not allowed. We would play basically God in this world. And it is up to God to determine these consequences in the hereafter. Such future determination has no bearing on the respect of the humanity of every person in this life. So that means Muslims are not allowed to judge people because of disbelief, because of practices, because of rituals. And Muslims have to respect the other person's religion and tradition. So now we come to the understanding of pluralism in Islam and how this is being deducted. I will read you two verses from the Quran, which is, the first one is chapter 49, verse 13. O humankind, we Allah have created you from a single pair of a male and a female and have made you into nations and tribes so that you may come to know one another. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Surely Allah is all-knowing, all-aware. So you see here one of the reasons, or the main reason why God created humanity. He says here, I created you purposely, knowing that you will be different. And the main reason is that I created you that you would come together to know one another, to get to know one another. The other verse is chapter 10, verse 99. Had your Lord so willed, all those who live on earth would surely have attained faith. Will you then compel people against their will to believe? So God tells here people that there is a purpose behind. He created people with free will. Some people can choose to believe and some people can choose not to believe. Or they can choose to believe differently than you. And you do not have the right to persecute and to force people to believe in the way you believe. So plurality in Islam means basically peaceful coexistence with those who hold different beliefs and convictions. So if we now look into the world and we look at what kind of legislations are there, how government rule minorities or people who believe differently. So there is multi-legislation. Multi-legislation is basically a state is granting those members of diverse cultures and religions the chance to prefer their own legal codes, and that the state holds no such task as producing legislation. So basically, let's say there is no constitution, and various groups, let's say Christians and Jews and Muslims, they would have their own rules, own constitutions, and they would rule themselves by their legislations. This is one way to rule, a government could rule a country. Then we have legislative unity, which means the application of the same legal system for each community living in the country. So there would be a single constitution and everybody has to adhere to that one constitution, similar to what we have in the United States. So Islamic countries in history, or let me use a different phrase, dynasties or governments, administrations that were majority Muslim, they used the legislative unity concept. And I will go into details on how they did that. And here's a verse actually that actually was revealed to Prophet Muhammad, which Muslims use to go with legislative unity, which is, let the people of the Injil, the gospel, the Christians, judge by what Allah or God has revealed therein. So even though Muslims chose legislative unity, they followed this verse and they gave autonomy to Christians or non-Muslims. And how that worked out, I will show you. So nevertheless, for societies pertaining to different religions and cultures, there were found rights and freedoms. So I will now show you verses from various sources that Muslims use to deduct laws on how to administrate when they are in power. Because in the Quran, neither in the Quran nor in the Hadith, the tradition of the Prophet, there is no suggested government system by the Prophet. The Prophet or God in the Quran never said, let's say, go with this government form, go with communism, go with democracy, or go with a kingdom or so. This is not written down in the Quran and not in the Hadith. However, in the Quran in the tradition of the Prophet, you see the way how God wants human beings to treat their leaders, and you see how leaders or collective leaderships, how they should treat their citizens. It is mostly about the relationship between the government, the leadership, the administration, and the people, the citizens. This is being written, you can read those verses in the Quran, but you will not find any verse in the Quran where God talks about what government form Muslims should follow. And actually, Prophet Muhammad, he was a leader in the city of Medina when he lived there. But after he passed away, the leaders in the Muslim community were chosen and elected in various different ways. So we cannot say this is the only Islamic way on how to choose a leader or so. So let's look at what Muslims or Muslim leaders used to deduct the laws in order to administrate and rule Muslim majority countries. First of all, the Quran. Chapter 2, verse 256. In this verse, God says, let there be no compulsion in religion. Basically, there is no compulsion in religion. You cannot force people to believe in a certain religion. Second, chapter 109, verse 6. Unto you, your religion, and unto me, my religion. This is another famous verse from the Quran. Then chapter 2, verse 62. Indeed, those who believed and those who were Jews or Christians or Sabians, that was before Prophet Muhammad, those among them who believed in Allah or God and the last day and did righteousness will have their reward with their Lord, and no fear will there be concerning them, nor will they grieve. So here basically the Quran talks about Christians and Jews. Scholars later on took these verses and they said, yes, in the environment of Muslims at that time, Muslims and Christians existed, but we can actually make interpretations and adapt these verses to people who believe in different religions as well. We don't have to limit that to Jews and Christians. Now the hadith, the tradition of the Prophet. Prophet Muhammad said, whoever killed a mu'ahid, which is a person who is granted the pledge of protection by Muslims, shall not smell the fragrance of paradise through its fragrance can be smelled at a distance of 40 years of traveling. So Muslims basically are not allowed to kill people that they are under the protection of Muslims, basically their citizens. Whoever wrongs one with whom a compact, a treaty has been made, and dhimmi in this case means a protected person, and lays on him a burden beyond his strength, I will be his accuser. This is in the hereafter. This is a famous saying by Prophet Muhammad. Now, a different source, which is the Constitution of Medina. The Constitution of Medina, there were various different rulings in here, and I pulled 3 of them out. So in which it says, the security, dhimma, of God is equal for all groups. So basically in the city of Medina, Muslims, Jews, some Christians, and pagans, they lived together. And they made a constitution together, and they chose as their leader Prophet Muhammad. And then they agreed on this constitution in which it says, the security of God is equal for all groups. Non-Muslim members have equal political and cultural rights as Muslims. They will have autonomy and freedom of religion. So non-Muslim members have equal political rights and cultural rights. Everybody has them. Non-Muslims will take up arms against the enemy of the Ummah, basically the people who live in the city, and share the cost of war. There is to be no treachery between the two. So what means, if the city is being attacked, all members, all citizens of the city have to defend the city, regardless of their faith tradition. Okay, now there is a decree to the Armenian Patriarch of Jerusalem. And this decree, copies of that exist in different places. And this is a famous saying of Prophet Muhammad during his lifetime. So the Armenian Patriarch lived in Jerusalem at that time, and he heard about the expansion of Muslims, that the religion of Islam was spreading. And he got afraid, and he was scared that Muslims would come to the city of Jerusalem and destroy the church or take over the Patriarch's place. So because of his concerns, the Patriarch consulted with different people, and the people actually recommended him to travel to Prophet Muhammad and ask him and share with him his concern. So he traveled, and then Prophet Muhammad gave him this answer. I, Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, prophet and the servant of God, I pay my respect to the Patriarch Abraham. I honor him and all the archbishops, the bishops, and the priests in Jerusalem, Damascus, and Arab regions. In other words, those people who are subject to Jerusalem, such as Ethiopians. I declare all of this in my name as prophet in the name of my Muslim faithful. And this continues, in which sentences he actually protects them and gives them rights to practice their religion, and he promises them that they will not be attacked or nothing will happen to them from the Muslim side. And this is a very long letter. I only captured this part here. So now we will go to the classical interpretation of Islamic law. In the classical interpretation of Islamic law, people are distinguished by religion. And by the way, so we are going now back hundreds and hundreds of years. At that time, the concept of nation states did not exist. So states or dynasties, people came together and established them based on religion, or based on tribes, or based on other affiliation. But it was not based on nationality. That did not exist until the French Revolution. So what we ever look at here, we have to use in the context of that time. We cannot adapt everything what you read here to today. So again, if Muslims, the Muslim dynasties, ruled the Islamic world as a majority, they distinguished people into three groups. Basically Muslims, permanent residents, non-Muslim, basically dhimmis, also permanent residents, and non-Muslim mustamas allowed to stay temporarily. We can compare that to the citizenship concept that we have in the United States. So citizens are Muslims. Non-Muslims are green card holders. And then there is people who have temporary visas who come and go through into the state. So if you were Muslim, you were automatically a citizen of the state. If you were Christian or Jew, you had basically a green card. And by the way, some Muslim countries, they followed these principles. The Ottoman state, for instance, followed these principles as well. However, towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, they changed the concept to a nationality concept, and everybody was equal. And I will come to that later. Dhimmi, the word dhimmi that you see here, it means non-Muslims living in an Islamic country, in a Muslim majority country, with legal protection. The word literally means protected person, referring to the state's obligation under the Islamic law, the Sharia, to protect the individual's life, property, and freedom of religion in exchange for loyalty to the state and payment of a tax, which complemented the zakah, the Islamic Muslim tax. So non-Muslims did not have to give the tax that Muslims give. They had to give the jizya, which was a concept for non-Muslims, which was higher actually than the regular tax. So non-Muslims who lived there, they did not have to join the military. And in exchange for that, they had to pay for the protection more tax. Dhimmis were also exempt from certain duties assigned specifically to Muslims and did not enjoy certain privileges and freedoms reserved for Muslims, but were otherwise equal under the law of property, contract, and obligation. And I will come to the differences. So the rights granted to the minorities. Rights and privileges granted to Muslims were also granted to non-Muslim citizens with some exceptions. So there is this hadith, a saying of the Prophet again. Those rights granted to us are also granted to them. So those rights who are granted to Muslims are granted to non-Muslims. And those taxes charged upon us are also charged upon them. A person who torments a Jew or a Christian will find me as a plaintiff against him in the day of judgment. In other account, he states, if anybody torments and offends the non-Muslim subjects in an unjustifiable manner, I am an adversary of him and I'll become his enemy in the day of judgment. Basically, Prophet Muhammad says here, you have to protect your non-Muslim citizens. You cannot treat them unjustly. Justice is a duty and a task of Muslims. The political administration rights. So dhimmis, the protected people, were the citizens of an Islamic state, of an Islamic country. They had the right of being employed in public services. So they would be clerks and accountants and so on, but not related to religious affairs. So what means is to religious affairs of Muslims. So non-Muslim dhimmis would not be able to work as a Muslim scholar, deduct Islamic laws or so, but they would be allowed to work in Christian affairs or in Jewish affairs, to work for the chief rabbi or the patriarch or so. They could not be appointed to such services as the president of the state, commander-in-chief, or governor. So this, for the most time of Islamic history, this was the case. However, towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, this changed. And then non-Muslims were equal citizens who could become actually governors, or they would be parliamentarians or deputies in the parliament. So here you can see some dhimmis were appointed to ministers, and this came towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. And they were administered by a religious chief who was elected from their own community. So the Christians would elect their patriarch and the Jews would elect their rabbis. And the patriarch and the rabbi would be basically the voice or the counterpart of the leader of, on the Muslim side. So when the Muslim leader would want to send out a letter or announce a new law or announce anything, he would go first to the Christian patriarch or the chief rabbi and talk to him, and it would be the chief rabbi's or the patriarch's job then to communicate that and cascade that down to his own people. So what are the essential rights and freedoms? So dhimmis, the protected people, had been benefiting from private rights and freedoms just like Muslims. They had the right for freedom of travel within the state, individual immunity, liberty of domicile. They could live wherever they want. They had religious freedom, and they were allowed to exhibit the religious symbols like the cross and the church bell at their places of worship. And they had the right for thought, meeting, and education. So by the way, I have listed that, but these are principles. This does not mean that throughout history, when Muslims ruled, this was the case. There were Muslim dynasties or leaderships who would not give non-Muslims those rights. Now we will look at an example of Caliph Umar. Caliph Umar is the second caliph in the Sunni tradition. And he was one of the most powerful, influential Muslim caliphs in the entire history. He was born 583 and he died 644. So after Prophet Muhammad died, Abu Bakr became the first caliph and the second was Umar. So what happened during his lifetime is he had a governor in Damascus. This governor wanted to expand a mosque that in the heart, in the city center. And he talked to the Muslims, and the Muslims would sell their properties to the city, and he would give them money in exchange. Then there was one Jewish person who also was on that land where he was planning to expand the mosque. He went to him and he said, I'm planning to expand the mosque, so I need your property. The Jewish person said, no, this is my property and I don't want you to build the mosque here. So there was a dispute between both. At the end, the Muslim governor got upset and he confiscated the property of the Jewish person. And he gave him some money and let him go. Of course, the Jewish person was very upset and angry. His property was taken away. So what he did is he traveled all the way down to Medina to see Caliph Umar. When he saw him, he was first of all very surprised because he was looking at the governor of Damascus who was living in luxury. And he was looking at the caliph to whom the governor was reporting to, and he was seeing a completely different picture. A very humble, austere person with a very humble lifestyle. So when he saw him and explained to him the situation, Caliph Umar did not say much. He took some piece and he wrote something on it. And he gave it to him and said, give that to the governor. So the Jewish person did not know what that meant. He did not know if the governor was going to help him. So he traveled back to Damascus and he stopped by at the governor and he gave him that piece to read. The governor read it and immediately he commanded and he ordered to stop the construction. He apologized to the Jewish person and he said, your property is yours. So Caliph Umar basically asked to destroy the construction of a mosque, but not to destroy justice. So this is a famous saying of Caliph Umar: destroy the mosque, but do not destroy justice. Justice is way more important than building a mosque or chanting or reciting the Holy Scripture of the Muslims in a beautiful way. Caliph Umar, another famous saying of him is, "Do not be fooled by one who recites the Quran, for his recitation is but speech. Instead, look to those who act according to it." So basically, look at the actions of people. Do not look at the recitation of people. And today in the Muslim world, you can see many leaders who can recite and chant the Quran in the most beautiful way, have beautiful voices, but how do they treat their own citizens? They persecute them, they oppress them. So here we see the importance of this very famous saying of Umar. Now we will look at the Ottoman constitution. So the Ottoman Empire was an empire that was established in the year 1299, and it lasted until 1922. So 700 years basically. And it started in today's Anatolia, Turkey, and that spread around all the way to Europe, to Vienna, then to the Caucasus, to Arabia, Egypt, Tunisia, and Algeria, all the way up. And it was the superpower of its time. And it was very multicultural and multi-religious. Muslims, Christians, and Jews, people, Zoroastrians, and so on, they lived together in this empire together. So again, when we look at the history of the Ottoman Empire, if you looked at that and compared it to today's understanding of what a citizen should have, what rights you should have, you would say it is not tolerant. It is actually outdated. It is oppressive. It is treating non-Muslims in a bad way. However, if you look at it in the context of that time, for instance, the 16th and 17th century, when there were pogroms against Jewish people in Europe, or when they were forced to migrate to different places, you can say that the Ottoman state, Ottoman Empire, during that time period was actually more tolerant compared to other states. There is a concept that academics use to refer to the Ottoman Empire. It is called Pax Ottoman. And Pax Ottoman was used in the 16th and 17th century to refer to a stable, multicultural way on how the Ottomans ruled the Ottoman Empire, that land. And it is also to express the Ottoman Empire's contribution towards peace during the times when the Ottoman Empire was the superpower in the world. And again, the Ottoman Empire was a balance between Europe, Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East. So within the time of the Ottoman Empire, we will look at the example of Jerusalem. Before I will talk about Jerusalem, you might ask yourself, why is Jerusalem that important for Muslims? Why are we talking here about Jerusalem? So first of all, Muslims believe in Jesus. And Jesus is one of the greatest prophets in the religion of Islam. That's why Jerusalem, the city where he was born, where he was raised, where he preached, is very, very sacred and important for Muslims. Secondly, the first direction of prayer for Muslims was Jerusalem, was not Mecca. Mecca came later. Muslims first prayed towards Jerusalem. That was the holy place for Muslims as well. And thirdly, there is a miracle of Prophet Muhammad. In this miracle, Prophet Muhammad traveled from Mecca to Jerusalem and was ascended to the heavens by God. This is called the Hijrah, the Miraj miracle, Isra and Miraj miracle. And here in Jerusalem, scholars say that he was on the Temple Mount, the place where you see the Dome of the Rock. And he led the prayer in front of other prophets, such as Jesus and Moses and so on. He met other prophets there. So basically, and there's other reasons, because of Prophet Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac, and so on. So the city of Jerusalem is very important for Muslims. And today it is the third holiest place for Muslims. So now let's look at the example of Jerusalem. In the year 517, the Ottoman Empire conquered Jerusalem. It was conquered by Sultan Selim I. Well, after he conquered the land, he ensured for all non-Muslim communities the right to practice their rituals. And then he copied the decree that I read to you before, the decree of Prophet Muhammad, and said, whatever was given to you by Prophet Muhammad and later on by Umar, I will give you the same, with the same decree. And you can find that same decree in the Armenian Patriarchy in Jerusalem and in Ankara as well. So he gave them rights. So what rights were given to them? Armenian gate priests would continue to be authorized to hold under their control the Church of Qiyamah and the Cave of Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. So the holy place of Christians will still be under the control and the leadership of Christians. Then all religious affairs, churches, temples, monasteries, and other sacred places would be under Christian authority or under Jewish if they lived there. And no one had the right to interfere. No one had the right to interfere into these affairs. Again, this does not mean that throughout the period, throughout the history of the Ottoman Empire, this was practiced everywhere. I'm just giving you an example during this time period in Jerusalem that this was practiced there. Then the Church of Markat Isa had no bells until 1545. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who is also actually responsible to build the wall around the old city of Jerusalem, he ordered to hang the bells, the Christian bells, the church bells on the church tower. And in 517, in Cairo, Sultan Selim granted the monks of Saint Catherine the same rights he had previously granted to the Armenian Patriarch and the Abyssinians and the Assyrian Copts in Jerusalem. So if you have been to the city of Jerusalem and in the old city, you still see these four quarters: the Muslim quarter, the Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Jewish quarter. And that existed during the time of the Ottoman Empire. For them, this understanding was peaceful coexistence. Today, if we look at that, we would say, oh, this is not good. They should mingle with each other. They should live together. They should integrate and assimilate and so on. But at that time, this was very progressive, that these people could live within the city wall together in peace. The population of the city was almost 43,000 towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, and half of thereof was composed of Muslims, 1/3 Jews, and the rest Christians and diverse nationalities. Now we will look at the example of Istanbul. So after Christianity was declared to be the religion of the state of the Byzantine Empire, Theodosius XI, by him, the conditions for Jewish people became worse. And Theodosius basically excluded Jewish people from most of the privileges of citizenship, while imposing all sorts of burdens on them. He, for instance, prohibited them from building new synagogues. Soon afterwards, during the reign of Emperor Maurice, all synagogues were changed into churches, and Jews were ordered to be forcibly converted to Christianity in Constantinople. So I'm saying this is the example of Istanbul, but at this time period, we are still in the time of the Byzantine Empire, which is Constantinople. Then in the year of 1453, Fatih Sultan Mehmed, the leader of the Ottoman Empire, conquered the city of Istanbul. After his conquest of Istanbul, Sultan Mehmed said the famous words, "I'm telling you all that as my subjects do not fear for either your lives or for your freedom, you are safe from my wrath." So basically, I will not punish you for not being Muslim or because you fought against us. The Sultan declared, people who had left the city out of fear could return to their homes to continue their lives in accordance with their own traditions and customs among Muslim Turks. In order to revive the city, many Greeks were brought from the east and the west of the country to the city of Istanbul. And Greeks who were new to the city were exempt from some taxes, and they were granted new houses or land if they did not own either one. In addition, landowners were furnished with animals in order to cultivate their lands. So Gennadios II Scholarius was the first patriarch of Constantinople under Ottoman governance. So the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, or Istanbul, existed in the Ottoman Empire. So basically the head of the Greek Orthodox Church lived in Istanbul, ruled from Istanbul his followers. And by the way, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople is still in Istanbul. However, I have to tell you, unfortunately, the patriarch today has less rights in Istanbul than he had before under the Ottoman rule. So to give you a few ideas about that. Here in the Ottoman Empire, they were allowed to administrate their own people, and they would be able to educate future patriarchs. They would have their schools and teach their religion. Today in Turkey, the rights have been taken away from the ecumenical patriarch. Since 1970s, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople is not considered anymore the ecumenical patriarch by the Turkish state. The church is today in a suburb of Istanbul, which is called I forgot the name, Balat. And the Turkish state sees the church as only a church of that suburb of Istanbul, not a global church, just of that small town within Istanbul of Balat. And the school where they educated priests and fathers has been closed down, shut down by the Turkish state. On top of that, the Turkish state says the following patriarch of this church has to be a Turkish citizen. Do you see that concept? What the Turkish state did? The Turkish state basically said, I'm shutting down the school where you would be educating your future patriarchs. However, your future patriarch has to be Turkish. So basically impossible. The Turkish state basically made it impossible for the church to survive. So the church will have hard time after the passing of the current patriarch to have a new patriarch. However, the current Turkish government under Erdogan a few years back allowed some Greek nationals to get Turkish citizenship to allow them perhaps to continue the future of the church. But you can see still the oppression and the persecution by the Turkish government. Okay, now I showed you some good examples of throughout the history of Islam. Now I will jump over to some negative examples. The first one is the example of Khawarij. And this example is very important because the Khawarij are a group of people that emerged right after the time of Prophet Muhammad. And they are basically behind the ideology of all the terrorist organizations that claim to be mainstream Muslim. So you name them, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, and so on. The ideology stems from the Khawarij. So the Khawarij believed that you had to oppose arbitration as a means to choose a new ruler on the grounds that judgment belongs to God only. They came to that because the fourth caliph of the Sunni understanding and the first caliph of the Shia understanding, who is Ali. Ali was in power and the fourth caliph of the Sunnis. And there was a dispute on who should be his successor. And Muawiyah, the governor of Damascus, actually disagreed with Ali. And he said, I need to be your successor after you are not after you pass away. Most Muslims, they disagreed with that. They said after Ali, he needs to be a son or so. However, since there was a dispute and there was fighting about that, Ali gathered together with Muawiyah and discussed that. And because he discussed that, the group that was called Khawarij said, the leaders sinned because the judgment belongs to God alone. If you sit down with a rebellion, you are sinning. And then if you are sinning, you are not a Muslim anymore. And if you're not a Muslim anymore, you need to be opposed and deposed. So what they did is they assassinated Ali because of that. And they followed an understanding that is very dangerous and which is called the concept of takfir, which means declared self-described Muslims as non-Muslims. So if you said that you are Muslim and you disagree with the leadership or with their understanding, their interpretation, you would be automatically a non-Muslim. And with that, they would have the right to kill you. And that was a minority at that time, and you can call them terrorists as well. So all Muslims holding different viewpoints according to their belief would be infidels. And they would commit takfir, basically become non-Muslims, become disbelievers, and to kill those they deem insufficiently Muslim. Must be one of their principles. So controversial groups who were inspired by them, who follow their doctrines, are Hassan Sabbah, Shah Ismail, or Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab. So the Wahhabis basically are similar, and I will come to that. So the concept of, here's an example of Hassan Sabbah. Hassan Sabbah was born in Iran, today's Iran. And he was the founder of the Nizari Ismaili state and its military group known as the Order of the Assassins, or the Hashashins. Hassan spent his life in the city of Qum, which was in Iran, and he was first part of the mainstream Shia understanding, the 12th Imam understanding. Later in his life, his family moved to a different city of Ray. And in Ray, the city was also home of a Ismaili, a different Shia sect. And there he was educated about the Ismaili sect, which is also called the Sevener Shia, Sevener Imams, not the 12 or the mainstream, it's a Sevener. Later on, he captured a fort and created his own sect. And he is famed for his decision to use assassinations as an effective technique of struggle against the decentralized Seljuki Empire with its vastly superior military strength. So basically, he followed the same understanding as the Khawarij. He said, either you follow my sect, otherwise you are a disbeliever, and if you're a disbeliever, we can go and kill you. On top of that, they used hashish and drugs to intoxicate, and they go and kill other people. Then the next bad example, negative example, is Shah Ismail. He lived from 1482 to 1524. And he was Azari Kurdish, and he was also part of the mainstream Shia understanding. And he was the founder of the Safavid dynasty, the Safavid Persian Empire. And you may wonder, today, the state of Iran is Shia, and who's responsible for that? How did that happen? Before Shah Ismail, the citizens of Persia were actually Sunni. Shah Ismail converted them, he used force to convert them to the Shia sect. Because of that, today, the vast majority of Iran is Shia. So if you listen to the previous lectures, you might have heard about how a Muslim should appear, how a Muslim should treat others, and so on. So a Muslim needs to be humble, austere, needs to have an austere lifestyle, and so on. Shouldn't show up and live in luxury. This person, by the name of Shah Ismail, who saw himself as a leader, was a poet at the same time. And now I will read parts of his poetry to you, and you can tell yourself if you think that this person was actually humble or if he was crazy or whatever. He writes, "My name is Shah Ismail. I am God's mystery. I am the leader of all the Ghazis, the martyrs, basically. My mother is Fatima. Fatima is actually a lady who is the Prophet's daughter, who lived about 1,000 years before him. My father is Ali, basically the fourth caliph, who lived hundreds and hundreds of years before him. And I am the peer of the 12th Imam. So I am the leader, the leader that the Shias were waiting for. I have recovered my father's blood from Yazid. Be sure that I am of Hadrian essence. I am the living Khidr and Jesus, son of Mary. I am the Alexander of my contemporaries. Look you, Yazid polytheist, and the adept of the accursed one. I am free from the Kaaba of hypocrites," and so on and so on. You can see the arrogance. You can see that he is not humble. And this person followed again the same concept that the Khawarij followed. He said, "I am the ruler. If you do not follow me, if you do not accept me as a ruler, then you sin. If you sin, you're a non-Muslim. If you're a non-Muslim, I can go and kill you." And by the way, the people that were mostly killed by these leaders are not Muslims, but are not non-Muslims, but Muslims. One more example, Muhammad ibn Abdul al-Wahhab, the leader and the founder of the Wahhabi sect. So Wahhabism was created in the 1750s in today's Saudi Arabia. The Wahhabis believed in a purified Islam. So they wanted to purify Islam from all the tradition, and they want to go back to the way the Prophet lived it. And they followed again the same principle as the Khawarij. They said, if you sin, you're out of religion, and so on. They were not as extreme as the Khawarij in terms of killing, but they were extreme in the sense of making people non-Muslims. For instance, for them, Shias were non-Muslims, Sufis were non-Muslims, music was not allowed, and so on. So here's one more example about negative examples in Islamic history. Last but not least, the Armenian genocide. I presented to you how the Ottoman Empire treated non-Muslims in Jerusalem and in Istanbul. And you could see that it was mostly positive, tolerant. But then there is this example in 1915 where the Ottoman Empire decided to destroy its own citizens, the Armenians. It was destroyed by a political party, a regime called Itaat ve Terakki, because they believed in a Turkish nationalist state. They want to transform the Ottoman Empire into a Turkish empire. And because of that and fears that the Armenians would have too much power, they decided to remove them from the lands of the Ottoman Empire, from Anatolia. Some were sent to death marches, and some were assassinated and massacred by the Ottoman army. So this is, again, one more negative example. So as a conclusion, we can say we have to distinguish between true Islamic teachings and understanding and anti-Islamic treatment. So what I mean by that, if you look at the principles and the theology of Islam, you can see the positive treatment of non-Muslims. But throughout Islamic history, you can find positive examples and negative examples, because Muslims are human beings. If they did not follow their religion, they treated non-Muslims badly. If they followed their religion, then for most of the time, they treated them with tolerance. So again, if they followed the Islamic principles, they were tolerant towards non-Muslims. So I thank you. This was my presentation. Now I would like to open it for questions. Please type your questions in the chat so that I can try to answer those. Okay, no questions, or did anybody type anything? If you want to talk and ask a question, then you can raise your hand and I can try to unmute you so that you can ask your question as well. think you should have a sign that would say raise your hand or so. So what is the difference between hadith and sunnah? So hadith is basically the collection that Muslims refer to as books, and the sunnah is the tradition of the Prophet. Sometimes it's being used in the same way. The sunnah of the Prophet is basically included in the hadith books. Oh, you spoke about waiting for 40 years. Did not know if this was afterlife and what it meant. So this was regarding if you treated Muslims, non-Muslims in an unjust way in a Muslim majority country. There was this famous saying by Prophet Muhammad. This was basically saying that you will have hard time in the hereafter. It was not talking about this life. It's about the hereafter. And the number 40 is just a number that he chose to say a lot. So in the Arabic language, the number 7 has a meaning of a lot, or 70 is very much, and 40 is also something like that. Okay, question is, how can we help relations now? I think the way you do it right now here, the way that we get together, we talk to each other, we let people share their views, and we let people explain, and then that we come together in a sincere way without any prejudice, by the way that we allow people to be human beings without believing in conspiracies about them. And we have to believe in education for them. We have to get together, we have to educate ourselves. And then when we are educated, we have to spread the word that we learned. I think inviting people to such programs such as tonight, or talking to them, giving them books about various different faith traditions, I think we can make the world a better place through dialogue, basically. Okay, next question. Okay, so some people, Bobby just wrote, I was interested in that 40 because Passover just ended, where Jews wandered 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness before they came to the land of Israel. Yeah, it is very similar to the Muslim understanding about Jesus, where he went into the desert and he fasted for 40 days. So the number 40 is important there too. And by the way, Prophet Muhammad became a prophet at the age of 40. So the number 40 is a magical number, if you will. So any books you recommend for children between 11 and 15? Right now, I don't have anything on my mind, but if something comes up, I will respond in an email to the group with recommendations for books. I will send an email out. Okay. Okay, there's one question. I'll unmute you. Okay, you should be able to speak now. Linda? Yeah, I'm not hearing you. Anybody else? No more questions? Okay, well, I thank you then. Thank you for joining us this evening. Next week on Thursday, we will have the next lecture. You can go to our website and check out what that lecture is. Well, actually, I can try to tell you what it is now. So next week on Thursday, I believe, same time, if I'm not wrong, we will be having a talk. When my browser opens, I will tell you. Discovering, it's going to be about Quran. About the Quran, the meaning of Quran for Muslims. It is going to be at 6:45, not at 6:30, but at 6:45, because the speaker lives right now not in Colorado, and she will break her fast and then join the lecture. And now we have about 10 minutes to go before we break our fast. So if you allow me, I would like to go now and join my family and break the fast.
I'm hungry, in other words.
Yes, exactly. I'm hungry. So now I can hear you. So if you don't have a question, Linda, I will end. Otherwise, I can try to answer your question. Oh, okay. Thank you all. Have a good evening and see you hopefully soon again. Bye.
Good night.
Right.